say you don't know who's to blame. You don't know my weakness, you don't know my fight. Ain't been in my darkness, so you never see my light. I bleed red like you. You won't get no proof. 'Cause even if I'm losing, I will never be defeated. And even if I'm crying, I will never let you see it. So I'm laying out all of my...
Hello, everybody. So my name is DC, and this is an intro episode for the FatBoy MMA Podcast. You might actually know me from another podcast that I do with my counterpart that I'm going to introduce here from over at Say Hello to the Bad Guy. So also I have here with me Locke.
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
So basically, we're doing this podcast called the FatBoy MMA Podcast. And if anybody has heard our other podcasts, you'll know that we constantly had MMA references. And so we kind of thought about doing an MMA podcast. So, I'm actually going to throw a question out here to Locke as to, who's FatBoy MMA? Why are we doing this podcast?
Well, I think the first thing is it's kind of surprising that it's taken us this long to get to an MMA podcast, because that's kind of how we met each other. And, so MMA is like a big part of, both of our lives or whatever. But,
Yep.
So it pretty much started just based off a conversation, off of a meme that you've seen on Facebook, I believe.
Yeah, no, definitely. I saw I saw a meme, and I'm pretty sure there's multiple variations out there that people have seen. But it was a meme of a old fat guy sitting at home watching MMA, and the meme was something like, "Hey, I would have whatever, insert whatever here." And as Locke said, me and him have talked about MMA and really grew our friendship around our love of MMA. And so I basically called or texted him, I forget which one, and told him about it. And we had a kind of a big laugh because I think in so many ways it represents a lot of people. And we're old fat guys that love MMA. But I think it's a little bit different than that particular guy. So Locke, what would you say is kind of the difference that would separate us from the guy that would just be sitting at home and saying, "Hey, I would have caught his leg and kicked him in the head"?
So I think the primary difference is the knowledge that we would not be able to just get up or just go punch that guy in the face.
Right.
So we know enough about MMA to know that these guys are the top tier, and whatever we just say or whatever our drunk uncle just says they would do is not something that we'd be able to pull off. And so I mean, just being longtime fans, we can actually break down the fights and stuff like that. Like, it's honestly it's an example of why you won't watch big cards at Buffalo Wild Wings.
Yeah. So for the fans that don't know, I used to frequent Buffalo Wild Wings to watch, in particular, UFC fights when they started having them. And the problem was there were so many new fans that would say completely off the wall things or say what they would do in these fights, and it was very annoying. Now, in a minute, I'm going to contradict this statement when you understand more about what we're doing on this podcast, but it was always that person, especially after a couple beers, that would talk about what they would do and how they can beat XYZ champion. And the guy is probably a big guy, 200 plus pounds. And in my mind, I'm thinking, actually, he wouldn't beat Mighty Mouse. So
my favorite casual fan observation is, "Oh, I couldn't go in that cage. I just go off."
yeah, go off right out the cage. It actually, I think we talked about this before, that got through out there on one of the podcasts, but I think that's what I loved about back in the day, Bully Beatdown, because you would have these tough guys that were bullies, and then you put them in there with a real MMA fighter, and it wasn't even under MMA rules. If you remember, it was like a wrestling round and a this round. and they would just get the piss beat out of them every single time.
Every time.
So,
So,
go ahead.
um, now obviously we're not going to be the first to the market. MMA podcast is a pretty crowded field. So how's it going to be different? How's FatBoy MMA going to be different from the other MMA podcasts that are out there right now?
So that's a good question. You got a lot of MMA podcasts out there, and you got a lot of them that are from, MMA guys, like, of course, Chael Sonnen and so many guys out there. I think what's different for us is, one, we're the regular guy that's a big fan, not a new age fan. Believe it or not, I actually my big, I guess, entrance in the MMA, or my love for MMA, I was a big Tito Ortiz fan. I'm not the biggest fan of Tito Ortiz nowadays, to say the least. But I believe I got into MMA right before Zuffa took over the UFC. I want to say around 2001. So it's been roughly about a 20-year mark. But so I think both of us, you haven't actually competed, which I'll let you tell that story. But both of us just having a big love for MMA, have done some, training before, but we're not the MMA guy. And what we want to do is we want to talk about MMA in general. We don't want to just talk about the highlight of the fight that just happened. We don't want to watch that fight. We want to go from everything from talking about a local guy to the history of MMA to legends in the sport to watching controversial fights, and pretty much everything in between. And what's cool about that is, as we do certain episodes or we talk about fights, what's really good is anybody that's listening and they're at home, they'll be able to watch and critique fights and things of that sort with us. And we kind of have a conversation about it. So that's kind of, my thought process of it. What's your thought process? And then also tell us a little bit about your MMA history.
Well, I definitely think, look, if you want to listen to a podcast about the latest event or the latest stuff that's breaking, then I know a guy, Ariel Hawani. Check him out. I'm not even gonna try and dip my toe in that water. That's like, we'd be in over our head. So, but
Right.
why can't there be an MMA podcast about Henzo Gracie? Why can't I talk
Hmm.
about Henzo Gracie on a podcast? You know what I mean? Because
Right.
that's not what we do. It's all up to date in today's fight and the next event and stuff like that. And I think based on how long we've been fans and our relationship, this is the kind of stuff that, you know, when you were at a bar bullshitting is what you would talk about. Who do you got in the Machida Shogun Hua fight? Who do you have winning?
Hmm.
Who was the greatest pre-Zufa fighter? Who's the, you know what I mean? Like some of the old stuff, the history of it. So, we can cover MMA in general, not just the new hot fights. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about that stuff when it comes out, but
Hmm.
that's not going to be the whole focus on the show.
Good point. Now, I'm not going to let you slide without telling us about your MMA history.
So, um, so I was a lifelong grappler. I high school wrestle. I started wrestling at 10. I wrestled most of my life. Got married, had a couple kids, got pretty fat, and was looking to get in shape. But I just didn't want to go back to the gym or whatever. And this would have been about 2005. When MMA was just starting to kind of get a little bit bigger. A
Right.
local karate studio in the area. Started doing MMA programs, and they decided to throw the local pizza place some money to post flyers on their pizza boxes. So as I'm sitting around fat,
Eating pizza.
eating pizza, thinking I need to lose weight, I see this sign for this, a karate place that's going to start mixed martial arts classes right down the street. And I thought, that'd be a better way to get in shape instead of just kind of go jog on a treadmill or whatever. I can wrestle. That'll be more fun.
Hmm.
And, from there, one thing leads to another. That's where I learned there's a difference between calling yourself a fighter and just being somebody that trained.
Yes, yes.
And I didn't like to not be able to say I was a fighter because I hadn't had a fight. So I had an amateur fight. I did a few smokers, nothing,
Hmm.
at this point that's like a million years ago. And I'm glad I did it when I did because the level of fighting that I was at, like the high level amateur,
Hmm.
if I were to dip my toe in that water nowadays, I would get the shit kicked out of me.
Yeah.
So I was able to jump in and jump out right before the talent base got over my head.
Yeah, these new kids are, yeah, I don't know what to say. It's like they come out of the womb with MMA skills. But the reason why it was really important for me to, to make sure that you told that story is because one of the things is, I think both of us understand and have that philosophy, when you hear things like people say, oh, so and so's pussy, oh, that. Any man that's brave enough to train and step into that cage, especially at a high level, you know UFC one, Bellator, anything where it's millions of people watching, is a man. And so the goal is not to respect, even disrespect. So even though we'll talk about breakdown, everything like that, we have a massive amount of respect for anybody that steps into that ring, that octagon, that circle, or whatever they're fighting in.
You got to respect anybody that made the walk.
Yep, exactly. So, question for you: understanding what we're trying to do, who do you think should be? So, as they're listening to this pre-episode, who do you think should be listening to this podcast when everything comes out?
Well, I think any MMA fan in general, obviously, and and I think people that not just want to hear about the top guys out there now. If you want to hear about old fighters, new fighters, most of my favorite fighters at this point have 12 losses because they've been hanging around too long. You know,
Yes,
I want to talk about the good old days, you know,
right.
that kind of thing. But I think also since we plan on covering like a lot of the history and maybe breaking down some of these controversial scoring and stuff like that, I think it could also be good for anybody that's kind of new to MMA or doesn't
Hmm.
understand the sport a ton. You could
Yeah,
you don't have to be a high level MMA guy. This will kind of maybe catch you up on some of the history of the sport or the ins and outs, of intricacies of how it goes, and not to talk to another trainer, to talk to another fat guy that you're going to hang out with at a party.
exactly, exactly. And this is where how I kind of mentioned in the beginning, the guy that is at Buffalo Wild Wings that says something off the wall crazy. The reality is, if you've been around a sport for a long time, if you train, if you watch for a long time, you'll hear that a lot from new age fans, and so then it becomes a disconnect where the old fans don't like the new fans and vice versa. And what I felt like was a lot of it is just a misunderstanding. So this would be a place where you can go and get the history of certain things. If you take a Jose Aldo, who at one point in time was in the conversation for the GOAT, and you may take a new age fan now that talks about how terrible he is and he's not a good fighter, and you can have that conversation to understand what and how much he did for the sport for a really long time, and crossing over from the WEC and having that belt and coming over to the UFC, and just kind of the dynamic of everything where they can get some of the history to understand a little bit more why maybe a person that's been watching longer has a different respect for this fighter that you may see as just losing fights nowadays.
Definitely. So now, as you hit on earlier, this is the intro episode. So when could people expect a launch?
Okay, great question. So our goal is to have our first podcast out by the third week in April, hopefully sooner. But that's our target right now. What we want to do is make sure we can record a couple episodes before we put our first one out. So that way we can bring you weekly podcasts without a break in between, unless we're doing some type of all season break. but making sure that we can really give you, once you come on board, you like it, you like the breakdowns, we want to be able to provide those podcasts for you every week. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So before we wrap up here, was it anything else you wanted to say, Lot?
Well, yeah, I need a shameless plug. So if you really like us that much and you need some more in the meantime, you can go check out our other podcast, Say Hello to the Bad Guy, and check us out there. That'll warm you up to at least the level of imbecility. I don't know what you would call it. That you could expect moving forward.
Absolutely. And when you go over and check out Say Hello to the Bad Guy podcast, you'll hear a bunch of people. There's a bunch of, Locke is the main host, and we have quite a few co-hosts, with me being one of them. And you may end up seeing one or two of them on this podcast. And also, we do have a goal that we'll end up reaching out to some local guys, maybe some other guys that are in MMA that may have retired, or maybe on the regional scene or even higher, because some of these fight breakdowns, we would love to also get a perspective for some of the people that's doing it right now, where you actually get their voice, but instead of them talking to another very high level person, they're having a conversation with two guys that's sitting at home just like you. Anything else, Lot?
Nope, I believe I'm good.
Okay, great. Well, once again, my name is DC, and Locke is my co-host here, and this is FatBoy MMA Podcast. Look for us coming to all of your podcast networks soon. Thank you, and have a good one.
You don't know my struggle, you don't know my pain, you don't know my past, so you don't know who's to blame. You don't know my weakness, you don't know my fight. I ain't been in my darkness, so you never see my light. I bleed red like you. You won't get no proof, 'cause even if I'm losing, I will never be defeated. And even if I'm crying, I will never let you see it. So I'm laying out all of my weapons, yeah. I'm leaving it all to the heavens, yeah. I'm learning from all of these lessons, that you can't back me down, don't count me out. I'm counting my blessings, yeah. I am a warrior. You won't keep me down, my feet are on the ground. You know that I'm a warrior, a warrior, a warrior. Yes, I am a warrior. You never swim my oceans, you never climb my peaks, you never run my river, 'cause our paths will never meet. You'll never be in my shoes, you'll never know my feet. Can't be in my kitchen, 'cause you'll never stand the heat. I ain't just like you. You won't see me through, 'cause even if I'm shattered, I will never be